Hi, Clint Colantro and week 4 video journal. This is the progressive era. This is one of my favorite groups of presidents so far that we've studied. Part of that is because this is the time that Arizona goes from being a territory to a state. And these three presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, they each play a part in shaping our state. And some of the policies that they have as president can already be found in our state's constitution and what was happening at the time. So let me just start with Roosevelt. So he is a Republican, but he is a progressive. And what's important about that is that progressives are, at this time, are both Republicans and Democrats. And so the progressive agenda is for labor reform and really providing the people of the country legislation that supports this new type of country. We're coming off of the Industrial Revolution. There is a shift in society where it is focused on industry and living wages, and people are moving away from the agricultural, ideal that's what America was, to now a nation of commerce and industry and manufacturing. And so there's all these. Also the suffrage movement, and it is part of this era as well. And so you have Roosevelt, and his connection to Arizona especially starts with the Rough Riders. That's a big deal. We see so many pictures of him as president. Well, not as president, but we see pictures of him wearing a cavalry officer's uniform. So him being and putting together this volunteer group of cavalrymen, when a majority, a large part of it, was taken from not only Texas but the Southwest and the Arizona Territory, for sure, had the largest number of volunteers, so to speak. So Bucky O'Neill from Prescott led the charge up San Juan Hill. Anyways, back to Roosevelt. So as president, he is promoting these progressive ideas. And it's mentioned in our book how he more or less was a compromiser. He understood that in politics you could give a little to still promote your agenda and to get to the goal, so to speak. And so as president, that his ability to work both sides, I guess, is a good way to put it. Thankfully, progressives are both Democrats and Republicans, so that's helpful. And when we get to our primary source, you can see even at this point, he still hasn't completed everything that he wanted to as president. And part of that is because he did have to compromise on a lot of issues. His policies, his foreign policy is an example where some of the things that he wanted to do couldn't quite happen, spreading democracy just like Wilson does, and that whole ideology too. But he also had to kind of reel some of his ideas back. So moving on. So now we get Taft. And President Taft, also a Republican. He is not nearly as popular as Roosevelt. Part of this has to do with him doing more to defend his position. He's a former judge, so that kind of plays into his personality as and what he sees as being his role as president. There's a quote, and this is great, by Taft on presidential authority, and it's that such specific grant must be either in the Constitution or in an act of Congress. This applies directly to Arizona becoming a state. So what we have in 1910 is the Enabling Act. And the Enabling Act actually gives the president the power or the authority to bring a state into the Union. Before, it was just done by Congress, and it was simply, that was the end of it. But a Republican Congress now at this point is fearful of the radical Democrats that are over there in Arizona. So part of the concession that the state has to make, and also part of this Enabling Act, where Taft did use his authority, is that they have to come up with a constitution. And what's interesting about the Arizona Constitution is that it sort of it collaborates with everything that the progressive movement has to offer for the country moving forward. It has the ability to sort of reel in labor and have a better control of industry with an elected corporation commission. It also has the power in our Constitution, the state's Constitution, of public initiative. So not only do we see all these ideas of the progressive movement of the common person having an effect on their government, they also have in there the power to recall. And what's important about that is that we can recall our judges. Also, the fact that it's only a 2-year governor term was frowned upon by many Republicans. So all of these things are in our Constitution for the state. Very progressive ideas. A lot of them come from Roosevelt himself. And prior to this, we had tried to become a state as well. And this goes back to Roosevelt, him being that great compromiser. So they put forth an idea to have New Mexico, which was a Republican led delegation for their constitution, be admitted into the Union with Arizona. Of course, it had to go, that was another part of our Constitution, is that it had to be placed before the voters. And it was also written into the Enabling Act of 1910. We rejected it completely. Like, no way, we don't have anything to do with, we don't want it. We want to be our own state. So that didn't happen. And because Roosevelt supported this, his compromise, like, hey, you want to be a state, he was denounced here in the state, where in Phoenix they even changed the name of Roosevelt, temporarily, of course, but obviously he even some of his ideals that influenced our Constitution, they quickly turned on him because he wasn't supporting us completely. So moving along, we got Taft. No way is he going to approve Arizona becoming a state unless they remove the recall clause in the Constitution. Fine. So it gets changed, the Constitution, that is removed, and within a few months after the president signing off finally in 1912 for Arizona to become a state, voters put the initiative to recall judges back into an amendment for the Constitution, which it passes. So you can see that Congress is trying to assert their authority. They give a fellow Republican the power, which is a first. Of course, New Mexico didn't have any problems. you know, with the Enabling Act, and they didn't have to concede anything to President Taft. So while he didn't want to use very much authority, he very much so chose to use it against the state of Arizona. Also, a progressive idea is that within a few months after we signed or we became a state, another initiative along with the recall effort was put before voters, and that is to allow women to vote. Now, this is 8 years before the 19th Amendment. Yes, 8 years before. So we are essentially the epitome of the progressive movement. We are a new state with progressive ideas that all come and are influenced in some way or another by each of these presidents. So I think it's really interesting that in this time of our history as a nation, and how the progressives are on both sides, both Republican and Democrats, it's pretty interesting. So then now we were leaving the presidency of Roosevelt and Taft, who were both Republicans, and now we have a Democrat, a progressive Democrat, and that is Woodrow Wilson. Something different about him, though, as far as him and promoting the progressive ideology, is that he didn't work with progressives on both sides. He reverted back to the partisan idea, and that part of that is that both parties are somewhat fractured with conservatives, and there is even Democratic conservatives and Democratic progressives, and same for the Republicans. But he chose to work with his own party, and that's kind of interesting because in a way it helps move along his ideas for just like Roosevelt did with his foreign policies. But it also, strangely enough, ended up hurting him. They did realize during his presidency some of the ideas of the progressive movement, the labor reforms, and so in that aspect they were very successful, and he was too as president. The problem is that it's I don't want to say that it's his idealism and his relations with other countries, especially Mexico, and this affects, again, Arizona greatly, because of his desire to spread democracy and also to sort of inflict the will of the United States on other countries. It's interesting, but it also helped. It helped to stabilize a good relationship, but at the same time, there were great ideas. It also created a lot of conflict, and so while the policies were sound, a lot of times the way that Wilson was so stubborn about them really affected their effectiveness. We see that in World War One. World War One is our seat at the world table finally, especially at the end of the war. So we came to the party late, but we ended having a chunk of the say in what goes on in world affairs. Also, what's kind of important to note too is that at the start of World War One, you have monarchies still in control of a good portion of Europe, Western Europe, and then of course in the East, the Tsar was removed, so Russia was not in in World War One, but that is the start of the Russian Revolution. And interestingly enough, too, they were all in some way related. But at the end of World War One, now we have democracy, which is Wilson's big thing, and that's his. He wants to spread democracy throughout the world, and he gets it. And this is his opportunity to help promote that. Um, all of the major families in power in Europe during World War I are gone. We have democratic governments established. The only one to survive would be England. Um, and so he comes up with this League of Nations, which is to protect that democracy now that we now have. Huge failure. Couldn't get it passed by Congress, and unfortunately, he passes away. And then we have an ultra conservative Republican to follow him. It kind of marks the end of that progressive era too. A lot of their ideas did get accomplished, which is also brings us to our primary source for the week. So in Roosevelt's speech, he is speaking to, I think, some of the progressive ideas that weren't realized. We still didn't have labor laws, and him being removed now as from the seat of power. He's able to really speak to the people and say, look, this is what we're doing. This is what we want. This is the kind of change we want. He didn't have to compromise at this point. And so that's why his speech is it's important to look at not only what had been accomplished at that point, as far as labor reform and the suffrage movement. All of these things were happening throughout the country, not everywhere. And part of that is now that he's no longer president, he doesn't have to compromise with anyone. And so he's able to really push his agenda in his own party. So now he doesn't have to worry about getting Democratic or Republican progressives to support him. So it's kind of an interesting way that we see him fall out of the public eye, I guess. But the ideas of the progressive movement are still there in his speech, and I think that's really important to shaping everything that we have today. So that's my video journal for this week. Thank you.